Hi guys, Dr. Hampton here. Welcome to my channel. I'm here with Dr. Nicholas Norwitz. Dr. Nick was my guest on the Protecting Your Nest podcast episode number 53. And I'll, of course, make sure to share the link in the episode or this show notes. Another term that I feel is really critical to make sure people understand is this term oxidative stress. So I decided to take us all to school. And who better to serve as our professor today than a young man who's already earned his PhD at Oxford and who also is a current medical student at Harvard. So, Dr. Nick, would you do me the honor of not only explaining what oxidative stress is, but maybe even explain what you feel are good ways to prevent and reverse it?
For sure. So, again, thanks for having me, Tony. I'm enjoying this conversation. I want to just caveat everything I'm going to say with the fact that when we do oversimplifications, I'm going to use an analogy to explain oxidative stress that I think is helpful. There is a little bit of misnuance in that I'm going to paint it as a bad thing. It's not necessarily bad. In ways, it can be adaptive, and we can delve into that if we have time and I haven't bored everybody. But the analogy I like to use to explain what oxidative stress is that of a bull in a china shop. So you can imagine a bull in a china shop. It bounces around and damages everything. Well, that's kind of like the process of oxidative stress. You hear these terms thrown around, but free radicals, or like superoxide anions, things like that. These highly charged or highly reactive particles, which have an electron attached to them, and they literally bounce around like a little bull in a cellular china shop and damage the walls and the china. By this I mean they damage the lipid membranes, they damage the proteins, they even damage DNA. And this can actually start some sort of positive feedback cycle because, say, if you're damaging mitochondrial proteins, mitochondria then become defective, generating more oxidative stress. So, big picture, 50,000 foot view, I think of oxidative stress like a bull in a china shop, and you don't want your bull too angry, breaking up too much stuff. That tends to accumulate, and that can lead to a form of cellular aging. So that's the big picture view. And now the question that follows is like, what irritates the bull, and really what at a cellular level produces, again, these terms are often used interchangeably, but reactive oxygen species, free radicals, again, these highly reactive molecules that are based on oxygen or include oxygen. Well, one major process that produces reactive oxygen species, these are the bulls, is something called reverse electron transport, where if you imagine the mitochondrial, it's called the respiratory chain, what happens is electrons get passed down the chain to produce energy. And these electrons at this one point in the chain, they can leak backwards, and then they can attach to oxygen molecules that are floating around in the mitochondria. And if they leak off early and attach to these oxygen molecules, then you get superoxide anions or reactive oxygen species. So again, basically, if electrons are leaking off of the chain, you can generate reactive oxygen species. This is called reverse electron transport. Now, there are ways you can, at least in theory, reduce the generation of reactive oxygen species. For example, there's some data showing that ketosis, the state of ketosis or ketone bodies, and I'm going to use some terminology here, but then kind of bring it down to earth. They oxidize the coenzyme Q couple. That basically just means the thing that kind of where the electrons build up and then causes them to push back and leak off, they can kind of relieve that tension, so to speak. So you're not generating as many reactive oxygen species. So ketones or ketogenic diets, in a lot of ways, this is one to grasp, is reduce the generation of free radicals. But then there's kind of two sides to the story. There's the generation of free radicals, and then there's the neutralization. You want to produce less and defend more. Again, we're simplifying a little bit, but being metabolically healthy can also help you produce those defenses. So even if you're producing reactive oxygen species, you have the generation of free radicals, you can neutralize them very fast. And people tend to think about, getting dietary antioxidants to support with that, like say vitamin C, have your orange or something. And that's not necessarily going to hurt, But the thing you have to understand is that those dietary antioxidants, they rest on a foundation of a healthy metabolism. So, for example, there's this biomolecule called NADPH, not to be confused with NADH. NADPH, it's the main molecule that helps with the reductive biosynthesis of all antioxidants, endogenous and exogenous. That's a lot of words for saying, you need good NADPH metabolism to support your antioxidant defenses: vitamin C, vitamin E, glutathione, thyroidoxin. So things inside your body and things that you take in. And interestingly enough, ketones can help support NADPH synthesis. There's lots of ways they can do that: transfer of hydride ions from NADH, inhibiting glycolysis to increase PPP production. Again, I don't want to go too down the rabbit hole. I'm spitting out some terminology here just to let you know it's not just hand wavy fluffy stuff. There is science behind it, and we can go into that if you want. But so, stepping back and to review, in case, and then I'm going to pause, see if you have any questions, and we can delve into whatever angles you want. I think of oxidative stress like a bull in a china shop. If you take nothing else away, I kind of like that analogy. You want to keep the bull kind of calm. Now, delving into the cell biology of it a little bit, you want to reduce the production of oxidative radicals, and you want to increase defenses and being metabolically healthy in general, but also ketone bodies as molecules can help support in that effort. And then the one more arm I want to kind of throw out there is it's not just about the energy metabolism, but also about the cell signaling. So BHB, the ketone body, is a potent signaling molecule signaling through G protein coupled receptors like HCAR2, histone deacetylases, so modifying gene expression that actually is a post-translational modifier on about 1,400 proteins. And in doing so, it's actually upregulating other proteins, antioxidant proteins like superoxide dismutase and catalase that can also help in the defense. So I'm going to pause here. I'm one of those people whose mind can bounce in a million directions, and I'm relying on you, Tony, to bring me back to earth and kind of direct me here. Put me on a leash. Put the bull on a leash.
Let's do this. There will be various levels of people who are hearing this message. So the first thing I want to briefly talk about is I hear, okay, ketone bodies are helpful, which implies that people who have that type of, if they have more ketones floating around, they probably will do better. So would it be safe to say that one of the ways to reduce oxidative stress is to increase ketones via diet or fasting?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And to be realistic, because where my mind was going there was in ketone body metabolism in the brain, just because that's what my PhD is in. You're going to get more bang for your buck for being metabolically healthy, which are direct effects of low carb diets, improving metabolic health and fasting. So, the ketones might be a nice bonus, but I don't want anybody to think it's an all or nothing thing. Like if you do a, well-formulated low carb diet, improve your visceral adiposity, improve your metabolic health markers, that's going to give you the main bang for your buck. Because this oxidative stress pathology, if you want to call it, it's interwoven with inflammation and insulin resistance. These are all things that feed back on each other. And so they all kind of improve together. You can't really target one. And I was kind of there narrowing in and talking about mechanisms by which oxidative stress gets targeted. But really, the main effect is going to be the indirect effect of getting metabolically healthy. And then, the cherries on top, so to speak, are the mechanisms by, say, which ketones could potentially help. But
all right. And the next practical question we'll wrap up with, in my training in nutrition and functional medicine, we talk about clinical applications of this other than diet. In other words, how do I know? So we talked about GGT, we talked about bilirubin as measures of oxidative stress. So what's been your experience as using those as tools? So if a patient, or should I say anybody listening, wants to say, well, where am I? And it may incentivize people to, work on maybe a keto diet or intermittent fasting as an example. But the bottom line is, are those tests useful from your experience?
Yeah, oxidative stresses are really tricky. Of all the those three, I think those are the three big pillars of metabolic health pathologies: oxidative stress, inflammation, insulin resistance. To properly measure oxidative stress is probably the most difficult. In fact, a lot of the markers that we use kind of are misleading. And I'll give you one example. When it comes to lipidology, people like to talk about oxidized LDL, OX LDL, which you can get in a panel. And one might think, oh, high OX LDL is actually a marker of high oxidative stress. Turns out that isn't really how it works. And that's in part because it's like a pass fail. So if you just have more particles around, irrespective of if they're big and fluffy or small and dense, you could have really high OX LDL despite not having high oxidative stress. Dave Feldman actually has a really interesting linear regression on this. It tracks perfectly with LDLP, which is a whole nother discussion. But I did an interesting test on myself to take another marker of oxidative stress and see how it correlated with, say, this OX LDL. And it was funny. I did some maneuvering and biohacking to get my LDLP high. So I knew my OX LDL would be high. And then did another test called an F2 isoprostane. This is a urine test, and it's pretty good for measuring oxidative stress. And the funny thing is, and I'm not recommending this. This is a do not try it at home sort of experiment because, I'm not suggesting by any means anybody should be bumping their LDLP. But my OX LDL was so high the test couldn't measure it. And yet my F2 isoprostane was so low the test couldn't measure it. So the test couldn't measure it on either end, but for opposite reasons, even though they're supposed to both be markers of oxidative stress. In terms of lipid markers, OX LPs, which you can get at Boston Heart, might be decent. But for myself, I don't really look at oxidative stress markers per se, and rather rely on the fact that I know insulin resistance and inflammation are interwoven with oxidative stress. Therefore, looking at things like lipoprotein insulin resistance score for insulin resistance, or fasting insulin levels, or measures of inflammation like HSCRP and then a cytokine panel. Like if your inflammation's low on a cytokine panel and an HSCRP, and your fasting insulin's low and your insulin resistance is good, my bet is that your oxidative stress is quite low. But the one thing I'll add to that is that oxidative stress, like inflammation, or like a lot of these processes that we just term as bad, like say mTOR activity, which is supposed to be, associated with decreased longevity, people tend to overlook the fact that our body is really subcompartmentalized. So we're not just like this big mush inside with right, like oxidative stress all over that's kind of uniform, or inflammation or whatever. It's temporally regulated, so over time, and in with specific sections of the body. So just as a fun aside, because I was reading this paper yesterday, there's a new paper came out talking about it had to do with oxidative stress. Signaling had to do with something called mitohormesis in T cells of the adaptive immune system. So now I'm going to kind of tangent to talk about immunology, but what it was basically saying was that, the state of ketosis, combining this with other papers, improves the adaptive immune response while quelling the innate immune response. So basically decreasing overall, just general inflammation, chronic low-grade inflammation. But then if you get an infection, your adaptive immune response, the specific part that shoots out antibodies, its memory is actually better. So there's a lot of specificity and technicality. Same with inflammation. Like after you work out, you want an inflammatory spike. It's called the fitness inflammatory signature. And in fact, if you don't have it, it's a sign of insulin resistance. A really cool paper came out last year called The Molecular Choreography of Acute Exercise or something. And it talks about that if you want to check it out. It's a longitudinal multi-omic study. But all that's to say, this stuff is complicated.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, bull in a china shop, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I think we'll wrap it up with that. But what I like about your response is complicated, but it's simple solutions. Which is if we just simply reduce inflammation. And for most of us in the space we're in, it's probably going to be reducing, we'll carb restrict, then we'll probably fix the things. We don't have to go to biochemistry class. We don't have to understand the complexes of the mitochondria. We just have to, let's make these lifestyle changes, which is a very practical solution for our patients. And I just wanted to
Yes.
kind of dive a little deeper, to kind of get that
Yeah.
message out. Yeah. So,
Did you ever hear Michael Moss's term nutritionism?
nope.
I think he coined it, but I heard him on a podcast. I haven't read his first book. I read his second, Hooked, and but anyway, I think he uses that term to describe the phenomenon that we're living in a day and age where we like to look at nutrition labels and like tick things off and try to be reductionistic, like I was just being somewhat hypocritically. But when it comes to it, this stuff is so complicated at some level that we really can't, on an individual level, really fathom what's going on. And in focusing on the trees, we do miss the forest. So I like that what you said. And as practical advice to people, I would say, what I just said are kind of like the things I think about and the reasons behind why you should do the things that Dr. Hampton is telling you to probably do: intermittent fast, go low carb, get good sleep, exercise.
Right.
And yeah, so it's
I think
again,
that's,
it's not hand wavy, but those are the
yeah. Well, we have to think about it, but again, for our patients, they just need to know what the next step is.
yeah.
But I do appreciate us diving a little deeper, because I think that in order for us to continue to move towards the right, what's the right process or the right steps to help people, we have to dive deeper and play with this information. So I really appreciate you,
Yeah.
doctor, for joining me on my channel and taking us to class today and explaining this very important topic of oxidative stress. So we appreciate you. And if anyone watching wants to learn more, guess what? Dr. Nick has a YouTube channel as well. And I'll make sure to have that information in the video show notes. I also encourage you to consider checking out his book. He co-authored, entitled The New Mediterranean Diet Cookbook, The Optimal Keto-Friendly Diet that burns fat, promotes longevity, and prevents chronic disease. So I appreciate everybody who's checking out this channel. And as I always say, be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest. And thank you again for being with me today, Doc.
Thank you, Dr. Hampton.